Hey gang, this video will be chatting about the second reading for week 3 here of Com 320 Language and Thought. And this is another reading from Hayakawa from Language and Thought. It's a tiny little chapter, chapter 4, called Context. It's only just a couple pages. But there's a couple of terms and ideas that are introduced here that are worth talking through pretty quickly, I think. And that'll bridge us pretty nicely into week 4 reading by Lee again, Facts First, Then Words, which will be the next video. So, contexts, right? So last video from where we talked about Hayakawa on abstraction was all about, language fairly specifically, and how it is that language helps us accomplish action, and it can do that in ways that are extremely efficient and quick, and it can also do that in ways that are more kind of laborious, right? And the general semantics approach is to want to be very concerned or cautious about the quick, efficient, very abstract use of language, right? Because the quicker we are able to get from A to B in terms of our language and our thinking, the more vague and general and broad our statements tend to get. So the general semanticists are always trying to bring us down to the level of hard reality, and what we will talk about in this video as the extensional world, right, or the physical world. So context is something that the general semantics approach must acknowledge and must embrace, and you can tell that there's a kind of a reluctance, that there's a frustration, I guess, right? So let's go back quickly to the serious man correspondence theory of language, meaning, and knowledge, the idea that there is an objective, stable reality, and that we can know it through our observation, through our testing, our measuring and verifying and close attention and all the rest of it, and that we can use language in such a way that not perfectly but very closely reflects that objective reality. So it corresponds with, the language corresponds with the external reality or phenomenon. And that if we do that tightly and accurately and with great care and focus, then anyone listening or reading can easily get the meaning from my very accurate, clear language, right? And that's the correspondence meaning. And if we're doing our job, and if we're being diligent and disciplined all throughout in terms of how we're interpreting reality, and then how we're formulating our own words and our own sentences and utterances, and then when we're listening to the words and sentences and utterances of others, we're being very careful to not infer too much, right? So there's a diligence, it's a good word, diligence, right? There's an arduousness, there's an intentionality, there's a very serious effort, a mental effort that must be used to improve one's own mental effort, right? And so it's this if we just get serious, if we just get focused and clear in how it is that we are interpreting reality, and then interpreting the language that we use to reflect and mediate and alter reality, then we should be okay. All right, so context, as Hayakawa rightly notes, is super important if we want to understand any language at all. If we want to understand any term, any statement, we can really only understand it within its context, right? And then he's going to go off and he's going to talk about 2 different kinds of context, a verbal context and a physical context. And he's going to call the verbal intensional and the physical extensional, right? And then there's 2 more terms, connotation and denotation. So that's sort of the whole bulk of this little chapter here. So I still remember an essay I read as an undergraduate, sort of sitting in your seats many years ago actually it was Stanley Fish, the guy we started off this class reading. I can't remember the exact title. It's quite of a long title, but it's about how it is that meaning or normal understandings of language or whatever, like any kind of a text, any kind of a statement, a little bit of language, only can ever really make sense within a certain kind of context, right? So meaning is really attached to the context of usage and interpretation. And the example that Fish gives in that class is like if you walked into a classroom and there was like something written on the board, and if it was like, there is no text in this class, I think it was his example. If you just saw that line on the board, you would have a hard time situating that statement, understanding its meaning, right? Because you don't really have a context. So there's many different ways that you can interpret something, but the meaning, the true meaning, can really only be understood by looking at all the relevant contextual factors, right? And that's really important. So when you go into a dictionary and you look up a word, what you're doing is you're looking up that word's position in relation to all these other words, right? So a thesaurus is really more of what a dictionary actually is, which is like, it's like these words, but it's not like these other words. It's about being close as possible to the correspondence between the word and the real phenomenon, right? But all we ever have is more words to describe our words. And so a dictionary is just words about words. That's one of the good insights of the general semanticists, right? Is that dictionaries are really just pointing to how it is that we use language in a general sense, right? And so it's like if you want to understand the meaning of text, then you bring in other things that are similar to but not the exact same as text, right? So in any given utterance, in any given statement or expression or whatever, you've got to think about it in its context. Because, my goodness, have you ever been quoted out of context? Have you ever said something and then someone ran off and said your sort of literal words but the exact kind of opposite meaning? This is why it's such a big deal to faculty, to professors, about like citing your sources accurately, because what you're doing is you're saying this is not necessarily my idea or even my word choice. I'm borrowing this from some other place. And academia is very strict about like being kind of honest and accurate about where you're getting things. And so footnoting is like leaving a little trail of crumbs so people can verify the things that you actually do say. So verbal and physical context. The verbal context is understanding a word's meaning in relation to all the other words, right? So that's, just sort of the language, the context within language. But then the physical context is the extensional, right? We talked about this already previously. We talked about the verbal and the extensional. He's building on these ideas, right? So the extensional context or the physical context is really just sort of like the actual real world activities that are happening, quite apart from language, quite apart from our interpretation. General semanticists are really committed to this idea that there is an objective reality that's happening. It's happening on its own. It doesn't really matter what we're saying about it or what the language is reflecting and representing, so much as it's like that's just all happening, right? And so the physical or extensional context is like when you're sitting at a park and there's a bunch of kids playing around in a park and dogs are running around and, parents on their phones on the benches, like that's the physical context for what's happening out there. So you can say like kids playing as a kind of statement, just those words, kids playing, and anyone who hears that might immediately think about like video games or board games or in the pool in the backyard or whatever. But in the kind of literal extensional physical context that we're talking about, it's actually kids on a playground and so on, right? So the extensional or physical context is the real objective life world as it's happening in its particularity, in its particularness, right? In its thisness. Thisness, thisness. That's a relevant word. It's not completely made up. It does sort of apply to the way the general semanticists want to think about the external, extensional, physical reality. It's very, very specifically itself, regardless of how we talk about it or report about it, right? We can get that close accuracy, but we always need to remember that the physical reality is on its own, essentially. All right, so on 36, we get extensional and intentional meaning, okay? So the difference here, once again, extensional is outside, it's physical, it's objective. Intentional is inside. Is it physical? Well, it's physical in the sense that we're talking about our brains, essentially, but we're also talking about our minds, which is a kind of abstract way of talking about our brains. It's this sort of virtual space where all of the brain's activity is happening, right? So in any case, that is the intentional. And note that the word intentional has an S instead of a T. So it's not about intent in the sense of what I'm intending to do, what I'm planning to do, or that sort of notion of deliberateness. It's intentional in the sense of opposite to extense, right? Extense or intense. Think about intensity. But it's about how it is we're feeling and how it is we're experiencing the world within ourselves. That's the intentional with an S landscape. So he says on the bottom of 36, the extensional meaning of an utterance is that to which it points in the extensional physical world. And then the next page, 37, second paragraph, the intentional meaning of a word or expression is that which is suggested or connoted inside one's head. All right, so we get now denotation and connotation. There's a lot of binaries here, but you can line things up. So extensional lines up with physical, lines up with objective, lines up with factual, right? All that outside of the body kind of stuff. And then intentional lines up with verbal, lines up with subjective, lines up with feelings, emotions, sensations, interpretations, beliefs, all that kind of stuff, right? So again, just like the serious man that we talked about, the general semanticists are committed to this notion that there are these kind of binaries, right? There's the extensional and the intentional, the physical, the immaterial, or the feelings based, right? The factual, the interpretive and subjective, objective, subjective. And that kind of basic framework really informs so much of how we think of how they think about language, knowledge, meaning, and so on, right? So add to those two columns, the first one, extensional, etc. Go ahead and add denotation to that first column. Objective, extensional, physical, external, denotative. And then to the second column, verbal, internal, subjective, connotative. All right. So again, we have essentially two columns, and all of these terms are kind of sort of sorting themselves in these two columns. And it's objective, subjective. Now it's denotative. Now it's connotative. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, if you just look up the words denotative and connotative in the dictionary, ironically, what they would suggest, actually, let me quickly do that, because I didn't even do that before I prepared for this. So, connotative. Let's start with connotative. Connotative. Connotation is commonly understood cultural or emotional association. Cultural or emotional association. That's interesting, right? So a connotation is an association that we tend to feel, right? So again, if I say kids playing, that just those two terms, you might have certain kind of reaction, right? It's like you might feel happy. The idea of kids playing, you might hear the sounds of kids laughing. You might hear giggling. You might hear dogs barking. You might hear squealing or something like that. And so the connotation of kids playing is a very kind of happy, positive, affirming, warm. You know, those are all the associations that we get when we hear that phrase, right? Denotation, just to contrast, again, look at my dictionary for the proper denotative. Denotation. Denotation is a translation of a sign to its meaning, precisely to its literal meaning. All right, so the literal meaning of a term, kids playing, denotes something more literal and particular in the external world, right? Now, in the example of kids playing, you got to think about the context, because it ought to be referring to something concrete and specific, right? Those kids on that playground with those dogs. You can name all the kids. You can see the parents. You can describe the playground. It's got 2 slides. It's got 3 swings, a spinny thing, a jumpy thing, whatever, right? So the denotation is the sort of more one-to-one kind of relationship between the language and the external world, whereas connotation is more of a one-to-one relationship between language and the internal world. Please rewind and review that little explanation if it doesn't make sense, because it's pretty important. I think it's pretty, it makes pretty good common sense that happens that way. It's not quite as clean as that, but it makes sense that the general semanticists would say, yes, connotation is about our subjective associations, and therefore less reliant, less true, less accurate, And of course, denotation then is more about the kind of literal connection between language and the extensional physical reality, right? And the examples that he gives here on page 38, he says, on the other hand, first full paragraph, on the other hand, when statements have extensional content, as when we say the room is 15 feet long, arguments can come to a close. He's very pleased with himself with his example, and it hasn't become obvious. This is where the general semanticists are happiest, is when we're only sort of, or as much as possible, dealing with extensional, denotative meanings and terms, right? What's interesting about the example he gives, though, this room is 15 feet long, presumes a certain kind of contextual knowledge, right? If you are living in Europe or Canada, it's probably not going to make as much sense because we're using imperial measurements here, the feet versus metric. What do you use in metric? Yards? Meters, right? So even the example of literal meaning presumes context, right? So this is why denotation, I don't want to complicate things too much, but denotation itself is not a perfect relationship between language and the external world because it's still governed by our contextual understandings of whatever it is we're talking about. So even denotation is contextual. Sorry to say, general semanticists. Even denotation is contextual. It's not universal. It's not like you can go anywhere on Earth and say the room is 15 feet long, and that will denote exactly those realities to anyone in China or Egypt or Morocco or wherever you say that sentence, right? There's still context at play there that matters. So we can't really get outside of those realities of language, context, interpretation, and so on. But the general semanticists want to try really hard to get to that kind of clean, objective, fact-based, no fuss or muss kind of communication. Excuse me. All right, so that's about it. So we get the denotation and the connotation, and then he ends up with the usual general semanticist, a plea for like, or acknowledgement that yes, things are kind of murky, and yes, context still kind of matters. But we need to, look what he says at the bottom of 40 here. I'm trying to draw out these moments where serious man and serious man's rules kind of kick in. So he says in the bottom of 40, 20 minutes, okay. If we can get deeply into our consciousness the principle that no word ever has the same meaning twice, we will develop the habit. That's a very serious man, general semanticist program. We want to develop better habits. Develop the habit of automatically examining contexts, which that's fine, you bet. And this enables us to understand better what others are saying. Better habits of interpretation, better equals better understanding. Better understanding equals less confusion equals less bad outcomes, right? As it is, however, we are all too likely to have automatic or signal. Remember signal versus symbol? Signal is more physical connection to the external. So that would fall in that first column with denotation. Reactions to certain words and read into people's remarks meanings that were never intended. So the general semantics guys are always acknowledging that we tend to not do the work of verifying and clarifying and rigorous contextual analysis. We tend not to do these things, but we should. There's lots of this finger wagging that's going on with these guys. So interpretations are unavoidable, but we must always do better to understand what is connotative, which is feelings, and what is denotative, which is factual, right? And if we can always strive to be more denotative in how it is that we talk and how it is that we interpret others talk, then we will be better off. More clarity, more understanding, less confusion, better outcomes. It all makes sense. It just seems like hilariously mechanical, treating kind of humans and how they communicate like little pieces of a machine, right? Because that was all the rage in the middle part of the 20th century, is like science and technology and logic will save us if we can just be really, really habitual in how it is that we understand the differences between feelings and facts kind of idea. So obviously this, once again, this worldview did not take over the academy. This is not the kind of the law of knowledge that is as it exists in the university. It was a momentary kind of momentary in the sense of, decades long, and there's still strands of it that exist today. But general semanticists, as they were writing like this, didn't last too much longer than a few decades, because it's just kind of unrealistic, frankly. It's not really super pragmatic. It's really just a bunch of finger wagging and like, think more clearly, talk more clearly, stop being so confused by the differences between, denotation and connotation. Come on, smarten up. Shake the cobwebs out of your head. It's a lot of this kind of daddy, like, stop being so emotional kind of thing. It's very friendly, but that's the general kind of tenor of it. And we're actually going to see a lot more almost like borderline nasty kind of assertions by Lee in the chapter that we're going to move into next. But hopefully that helps in terms of like getting better on the vocabulary and the assumptions that the general semanticists were using and deploying and trying very hard to get into practice. So see you in the next video, and we will continue.